Hello, and thanks for joining us. I'm Kevin Nealon. Our top story tonight, it appears congratulations are in order. We are monitoring things closely as details continue to come in, but it seems, yes, I have confirmation. We're talking about you, Joseph. Congratulations. You really outdid yourself this time, which probably wasn't that hard. Our team has discovered footage from one of the many celebrations taking place in your honor. Stay away from drugs, kids. Now for some deeper analysis, let's go live via satellite to our special guest commentator, Other Kevin. Other Kevin, what are your thoughts on all this? Speechless, Kevin. Wow. Just wow. Insightful as always. Thank you. Well, I'm now being told that we are out of time and that I should pull this lever. I'm Kevin Nealon. Thanks for watching. Take care, Jimmy. Thanks, Bob.
Joseph Jaffe is not famous. I'm famous. Joseph Jaffe is a delusional human being who thinks he's famous. He's not famous. He's not famous. I'm famous.
This is my best kind of shoners. We didn't touch one of them, not even one of them. I'm not sure which one is Paul Rudd and which one is Lane Green.
Final card here is the ultimate outcome.
Today is take your dog to work day.
Like Scooby-Doo.
Without further ado, his debut.
Sweet Caroline.
Everybody say hello to Sammy. Is it not good?
I'm just pausing so that you just are at the front of your screen.
I'm so enormously flattered.
Branding is not a bad blind date.
I'm gonna have to take a picture of this.
No, this is agape. This is love.
I really enjoyed this. You did do your homework. You asked great questions.
I'm flattered. Thank you. You just made my day.
Look at you! You are insane!
How did I do that?
You're
How did I do that?
insane! You're insane.
I might be insane, but it's passion, for God's sake. It's passion. It's passion. I believe sometimes in my own lies. I guess that is maybe that's delusion. I don't know. But welcome back to another episode of Joseph Jaffe is Not Famous. I am thrilled whenever a guest returns because I remember back in the day in my marketing college days, there was that line which is, you can get everyone in the world to try your Big Mac once, right? You can get everyone to try the product, but when they return a second time, well, that's when you know you're either doing something right or they're just a masochist and a sucker, a sucker for a punch, I guess. But Seth David Radwell is back. He wrote a book called American Schism. It is lauded. It is best-selling. I'm just going to make up a couple of alternative facts and say it's Pulitzer Prize winning, Nobel Peace Prize nominated. But in all seriousness, it is incredibly lauded, and I'm excited because today we're gonna talk about it. We're gonna talk about everything going on in this crazy world that is spinning out of control. We're going to talk about woke or anti-woke. We'll talk about college campuses. We'll talk about Trump. I am going to be completely uncensored insofar and in that Seth and I were discussing in the green room that, every time we talk about politics or saving democracy, the spiders and the bots on Google and wherever shadow ban and ultimately, just reject any form of promotion or any form of distribution. And it's got to stop. I mean, I guess when Seth comes on, we'll talk about X. There is a whole, I don't even want to call it a kerfuffle going on right now with the Australian government v. Elon Musk. So I don't know, where do you stand at the end of the day? We will discuss and you will decide. And if you like this show, and why wouldn't you? I mean, seriously, why wouldn't you? I've only done 700 of them. Please go to bit.ly/subscribe to the show to subscribe to the show. I will not rest until the show is on CNBC or the equivalent. Maybe Seth can help me. Or if you're watching, go and tell a famous friend or so, because I am bipartisanly not famous. But enough about me now. Let's get to our seated soliloquy. And the seated soliloquy today is called, Why Can't We All Just Get Along? I'm pretty sure that that was the line that Jack Nicholson uttered as the president of the United States in the legendary movie Mars Attacks, before he was then speared and stabbed and taken out. But why can't we all just get along? Why? Why are we now so partisanly, divided and destroyed to the point where up is down and down is up and right is wrong and wrong is right and left is right and left is wrong and right is wrong? You know what I'm trying to say. It's confusing. It's confusing for me, having gone through and living through the events from October 7th. And suddenly all of the commentators that I mean, how do I put this mildly? Despised, perhaps? Suddenly I was aligning with. People like Ben Shapiro. I really don't like anything that comes out of the man's mouth. But suddenly I was completely aligned with him as he spoke about what was happening and unfolding, the blatant double standards, the hypocrisy, anti-Semitism. And then I started to doubt everything. Well, if this is true, then what if the other things he talks about is true? Or if everything he talks about isn't true, then maybe this isn't true at all. But that is a fool's errand. It's not the right way to think about it, because at the end of the day, the only right way to think about it, whether you are left or right of center, is to focus on the truth, is to focus on facts, focus on the truth. Make up your mind for yourself, regardless of who the person is, regardless of what they're spewing from their mouth. Evaluate it, do your own research, as we say in the Web3 and crypto space, and ultimately align yourself with common sense and with the truth, instead of blindly taking the side of your party. Because if anything has ever been more true right now, it has to be country over party. But what do I know? I'm just a talk show host. The person that knows something or two is my guest, Seth David Radwell. Seth Radwell, author of American Schism, How the Two Enlightenments Hold the Secret to Healing Our Nation, is an entrepreneur, business executive, and recognized thought leader in consumer marketing. A common thread across all his leadership and business endeavors has been his passion for our shared democratic values and his interest in American public policy. Radwell previously served as president of eScholastic, the digital arm of the global children's publishing and education company. Until 2018, he served as the CEO of the Proactive Company, the leading skincare brand for acne. Prior, he served as president and chief revenue officer of Duffy Renker, the worldwide leading direct-to-consumer beauty company. Prior to his days in e-commerce and the internet, Mr. Radwell spent 6 years with management consulting firm McKinsey. I just saw the other day that there's some lawsuit against them. Radwell received a master's degree in public policy from Harvard University's Kennedy School for Government. How's that Harvard thing working out for you? He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree, summa cum laude, from Columbia University. You really pick them, don't you?
Yes, I'm very proud, Joseph. First of all, it's wonderful to be back with you. That the universities that I've attended are all firing their presidents and up in arms all over the country. So that's I don't know if that's a tribute to the craziness of the world, but I am thrilled to be back here with you.
Or it's maybe just, in the wake of Radwell destruction. As you leave, you just create chaos in your wake. I don't know.
Right.
No, I'm so happy that you're back as well, and there is so much to talk about. And I've been pre-recording these and putting them out a little bit later, but you came back to me and I said to you that that there was a long lead time, etc. And you're like, I need to talk. I have a message. It is relevant. We need to have intelligent discussions right now with intelligent people, and slim pickings right now in terms of finding intelligent people that can have intelligent conversations. What the hell's going on?
Well, the first thing I wanted to say is I heard what you were saying about truth and the sanity that you were proclaiming, and I'm more and more convinced that you and I may be twins from different mothers, because I've been discussing these issues for quite a while, and one of the reasons I wanted to come back is not only did I really enjoy being with you, and I find you very both entertaining and informative, but a lot of the predictions and things that I wrote about, which are now 2 years ago in American Schism, have turned out to not only be true, but become much worse. And I think that's why the book hit such a chord and won the International Book Award last year. And it's so I'm increasingly being asked to speak about some of the themes, because the world seemingly is really going crazy. I mean, it's almost that if you were an alien species looking down at us as humans from another planet or galaxy, you would think these guys they're going to be extinct pretty soon. They just can't figure out how to get along, how to solve the real problems like climate change, and there's an ado about everything that doesn't make sense. So I think we're as a human species, despite 250 years of good progress on prosperity, we're really at a turning point. And the only other last thing I want to mention before getting into more of a dialogue with you is that the part of the problem that I talk about in the book American Schism is the paradox of the frustrated majority. And what I mean by that is that there is 70% of the public in the US that recognizes that the voices on the left and the right, the extremes, are crazy and they're counterproductive, but yet they feel like they have no way or ability to change that, to wrestle back the gavel from the lunatics that are running the asylum. And, it's shows like yours, Joseph, that I think is hopefully helping to get people in the frustrated majority to take action.
Now, when you talk about the lunatics running the asylum, I was going to say, but enough about Congress. Let's move on to other topics. Yeah, I mean, we've always, even in marketing, we would talk about the idea of the active minority versus the silent majority. And the silent majority, the disempowered or the disenfranchised voter, the median voter theory states, show up, step up, vote, make your presence felt. And we've seen in a variety of races, votes coming down to tens and hundreds of votes. It's getting too close to call. And of course, we know what happens when that happens. Everything from hanging chads to hacked voting machines, and we're back in this mess. So I think it's a common thread we got to come back to, the silent majority, the frustrated. You see, you're calling it the frustrated majority, as opposed to whether they're silent or not, because there's so much noise right now.
Yes.
And even with what's going on right now with college campuses, we'll talk about that as well, it just falls on deaf ears. It goes in one ear and out the other.
Right.
Nothing is landing. How do we get stuff to land?
So first of all, I want to come back and explain why I call the frustrated majority a paradox. It's a paradox for two reasons. The first one is pretty obvious, which is that because the incentives both in the media and the political system give much more voice to the extremes, and there are reasons why. Of course, the extremes in media, for example, are what get clicks and eyeballs. The details of problem solving is kind of boring, right? So it's the extremes that get the air. Similarly, I think elected officials have recognized that the way to mobilize voters is not by solving problems, but by pushing buttons, what I call amygdala-driven buttons of fear, rage. That's what mobilizes voters. So you have two major actors in the political system, elected officials on one hand, and the media, that are both non-concerned with truth, but with concern with causing rage and anger and amygdala reactions. Okay, let's start there. So the reason why the paradox of the frustrated majority is important is because the 70% think they're in the minority, because the minorities are much louder. So that's kind of what is often similar to the old analogy of the silent majority. But there's another paradoxical aspect of this, which I want to raise. You talked a couple of minutes ago about the importance of the pursuit of truth. And the people in the frustrated majority, many of which are business people, my former peers, CEOs, most of them are act in an empirical framework. That is, they go to work every day and they try to solve problems. They look at data, they reason. And that is precisely the skills that we need in the public sector. So it's a paradox, because problem solvers like my peers in business are the very ones that can help resolve some of the dilemmas that we face, but yet they're crowded out. They don't speak. They're on the sidelines for fear of touching the third rail. They don't know how to get involved. So that's why this frustrated majority dynamic is so paradoxical.
So you said something, and I want to go back and repeat it, which I actually think is a very interesting insight, which is that the majority think they're the minority because of all the noise out there. Certainly as a percentage of noise, they are the minority. Does that mean, what's the implication? Is the implication that we need to mobilize the majority, we need to empower them, we need to activate them, we need a different kind of activism, not the activism that we're seeing, or maybe I was going to say, who am I to judge? But hell, I am going to judge. I'm going to judge. But how do we get that silent, frustrated majority to wake up?
Well, so I spend most of my time on one portion of that silent majority, frustrated majority, which are business leaders, which are really a big part of it. Now, I was on a focus group yesterday with Frank Luntz, who's a famous focus group person in the States, with 20 CEOs. And the reason why this is such a difficult problem is because most of the 20 CEOs don't think that there's a crisis going on. They think this is business as normal, and that they want to stay focused on solving their business problems, focusing on their shareholders. And, I maintain that that's part of the issue, is that there certainly have been eras in our history when we've been very divided. In fact, the whole purpose of my analysis in the book, American Schism, is to go back to our founding and try to draw lessons, or, what lessons can we learn from the periods in which we were divided. And I think there's a lot to learn, which we can talk about. But if I had to sum it up for your listeners briefly, what I would say is the history of our divisions across 250 years show that we've had a secret sauce, a magic formula for moving past our divisions and moving forward. We never really had people agree on issues, but we were able to move forward using this secret sauce. And the reason why I maintain that we're in crisis today is precisely because we've abandoned that secret sauce. We're moving against it as opposed to towards it. And the secret sauce involves three elements, which I can go into more detail. But I believe we're in a crisis because the frustrated majority, as we talked about, does not believe or understand that not only are we super hyperpolarized and divided, we're moving to a further divisiveness. We're moving away from solutions.
The schism is becoming a chasm.
Yes, correct. The schism started out in the 18th century, the original American schism, as being a difference of a vision of what the American experiment should be. And over the years, it's transmogrified, it's changed. But it's always had some aspects that have stayed similar. Like, for example, the original schism today, one of the manifestations is this populist versus elitist tension. there's other key aspects that I talk about in my articles in the book, but the fundamental issue is that the formula involves certain elements that, like, for example, and I go through this in the book, in the I'll give one example. In the 1880s, during what became known as the Farmers Alliance, the farmers of the country, both in the South and the West, were getting killed by the industrial North's the power concentrated on banks, railroads, and oil. And they were making it impossible for farmers to earn a living. And so what started was the Farmers Alliance, which was a populist movement of farmers trying to learn how to work together, to do cooperative buying in big groups, to learn how to push back against the powered interests. And so it was a bottom-up populist movement that was positive, as opposed to some of the populist movements that we see today, which we can contrast. But my point is that initiative began a process of mutual understanding that led to the progressive era, but it took 30 years. I mean, the progressive era wasn't until the 1920s when presidents like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson recognized that banks and railroads were too powerful, and they had to break those up. So what I'm saying is there's a formula for change, and sometimes we get stuck. And sometimes change happens enormously quickly. The time between 1776 and the Constitution adoption in 1787 and 8, there was a huge swing, a huge set of compromises, which are also discussed in the book. So I think these experiences are very important to understand, to see how we can get out of our current dilemma. What I say sometimes, Joseph, is that history can act as a salve for our wounds if only we'd apply it.
Well, okay, there's a lot in what you shared, and so first of all, I'm going to work backwards.
Yeah, sure.
The first is, you threw out the little C word, which is compromise, which is actually more like a giant elephant in the room, or an inability to meet in the middle, right? To reach across the aisle, if you will. So that's definitely an issue. The other thing, look, first of all, I need to know what the secret sauce is. I need to put some of that ointment on me, and people need to rub it all over ourselves. But I was also struck by which CEOs in their right minds don't think that the world is kind of burning right now. And I don't know if you followed this, but Elmo, Elmo can we connect the CEOs of the world with Elmo? And what I mean by that, if you weren't following, is Elmo put out this little innocuous tweet a few months ago saying, "Hey, just checking in, everything okay with the world?" And millions and millions of views and thousands, tens of thousands of comments basically saying, "No, Elmo, we're not okay. Things are not good. The world is literally burning to the ground." And poor Elmo's like, "Hey, listen, I'm just a eternal 3-year-old, red puppet. So just give me a break." Didn't quite say it in those words. But which CEOs in their right minds do not think that the world is is burning?
So I speak to CEOs every day, and some of them do recognize how serious this crisis is. But it's amazing to me, the analogy I would use, Joseph, is I recently was on a panel with 15 business people from Venezuela who all ran big businesses 20 years ago in Venezuela. And they all explained how the dissolution of the market economy and the stability and the rule of law, it felt like it was gradually eroding, and then it collapsed overnight. And I feel like we're in that spot today. But CEOs somehow continually point out often how we've gotten through this before. We've always been divided. We will, the republic will sustain. And this kind of denial that is very scary. I mean, to be frank, that's why I do this work. I mean, you don't leave. I was a CEO a couple of times, and you don't leave a job as CEO to write a nonfiction book to make money. This is about trying to engage this element of the frustrated majority, business leaders, that they have to do something. So we could talk in detail about why they're so in denial. I think that's the core of the problem. But denial, I do want to also get to the secret sauce.
And we'll come back to that. But just a couple of quotes. First of all, as you know, denial is not a river in Egypt. You know that, right? So,
Yes.
so that's the one thing. The other thing is, when you were here last, I always find a quote, and it seems like this is the right time to come up with this quote, which is, "It's nice to say let's be bipartisan, but we're a partisan nation. We were raised as a partisan nation," and this was by Colin Powell said that, and I think that's a good backdrop and bridge to this idea of what is healthy tension, what is healthy, checks and balances. Ultimately, what does the process or the mousetrap look like when it is functional, or when the wheel is turning, when things are working? And what is that secret sauce that actually, almost like the grease that kind of kept the wheel turning?
Right. Well, that's a great question. And I think there's a big difference between partisanship when it's based on a healthy competition of ideas based on our Enlightenment inheritance of empiricism, facts, and reason. And that healthy debate is what partisanship can be when it works. When it devolves into a bitter ad hominem set of attacks where the people with the ideas become the enemy, that's when it falls apart. So this is a perfect segue, because the first part of the secret sauce is, in any political discussion, there's always a mix of reason and facts and emotion. And the first element of the secret sauce is when you allow the empirical framework of facts and data to drive the solution, and not allow the emotions to overwhelm the pursuit of truth. So the first part is this notion of working in an empirical framework, and understanding why that's collapsed is we talked about it briefly before. The whole notion of fact-based journalism is I just wrote a piece recently about this. I mean, the journalistic industry as a field of expertise, as a entrepreneurial but also professional civic conduct or profession, was brought up precisely to get past the yellow journalism of the 19th century. So all of a sudden, whether it was Joseph Pulitzer originally, we started to teach how the pursuit of truth was at the center of the hierarchical value system within journalism, and what it means to pursue facts and to verify sources, and to all the things that would constitute what journalism schools over the country, starting in the early 1900s, really 1920s, started believing. Now, that has gone away in the last 30 years. I'll give you one example. We had a tremendous farm system to train journalists on how to do this. And it wasn't only journalism schools. It was thousands, tens of thousands of local newspapers spread out across the country, where young journalists would start to work and learn their craft, and learn, based on local issues and local coverage, how to report on issues, how to build a credibility, how to assure that there was a separation between editorial and advertising, the business model, and which was classifieds, by the way, in most papers. And the numbers show that 75% of those jobs are all gone, because most local newspapers have folded. So we no longer have a training system for how to train journalists. And so that's part of the reason why journalism as a profession, and therefore the pursuit of real truth, that's the supply problem in media today. So anyway, so the first, I want to come back to the first thing that I want to emphasize is using an empirical framework.
And Seth, I want to just add a point as well, which is there's also a like a vicious cycle in terms of, you talk about healthy debate, and I'll give you an example. Let's talk about what happened on October 7th, right? So October 7th, position is going to be, there was peace before, and then there was an invasion with incredible, unprecedented brutality,
Yes.
But then the counter argument is, well, why did that happen? Well, what caused that? Or that the actual attack was provoked, or that something came before. And then we get into this he said, she said, she said, she said, he said, he said. It's the same thing like being able to talk about Israel versus Palestine, to the point where you again go all the way back to biblical times.
Yes.
To create which came first, right? The chicken or the egg? Which
Yes.
came first, the Palestine or the Israel? Now, in addition to all of that, we have another debate, a discussion going on about the civilian to militant ratio, and even when that is put forward, the argument then, or the counter argument, becomes, well, why are you comparing this to something else? Isn't a human? So, what's that saying? There are none as deaf as those who will not hear.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I come from the media business, as do you, from the marketing business. I did a lot of work with the NAA, right? The Newspaper Association of America. We've seen what's happened to journalism. I love the point you made about training as well. And ultimately you're making the supply and demand cases. But as I said earlier, how are we going to ensure and assure that when the truth is emitted, it lands, it's processed, people can then say, okay, this is I don't know if it was in our episode, I spoke about, we need a Supreme Court of truth. So we need here is the definitive answer. It's not Wikipedia, it's not Quora. Now it's the answer, and now we all have to accept it.
So this is a wonderful point. And first of all, I would recommend to your listeners a wonderful book called The Constitution of Knowledge by Jonathan Rauch. And that book's very interesting because he discusses what knowledge actually is, what truth is, which is always contingent on a transparent process by which facts are tested against by experts who know the field using empirical data. And when something is proved untrue, it's no longer knowledge. It's replaced by something else. Now, that process that he describes of how we've built this decentralized constitution of knowledge is very important. And I would argue it's the reason why we're responsible for, 200 years ago, life expectancy on the planet was 30 years. Now it's over 70 almost everywhere because of this incredible constitution of knowledge that we've built. But here's what you have to understand, in my view. There has been an assault against this model for 50 years now. It's called it's the whole Frankfurt postmodern school, which rejects that truth exists. I mean, this has infiltrated every aspect of our society, this rejection of the Enlightenment. And it started out, I mean, the best examples are I would argue the entire left movement, which was sometimes called woke, is completely embracing the notion that there's no such thing as truth, that justice is about power, is whatever who's in power say it is. So this is a Foucault. I mean, if your listeners who are familiar with philosophy, Michel Foucault, which is the great Reconstructionist French philosopher, this was all about what he wrote about 50 years ago. But this is now this postmodernism. I call it lay postmodernism. It's not the now interpretation is that everyone's allowed to have their own facts. How convenient! We can all have our own facts and live in our own bubble, and it affects every part of our life. It's what creates this identity politics. It's what's behind. There's no such thing as male, female. We can be on the spectrum. We can be both. This notion of fluidity. Now, here, let's take a step back. This school of thought was very positive in its intent. The intent of the postmodern movement, when you really go back and look at it, was the feeling that most of history and the Enlightenment, for sure, were written by white European males. And it was important to incorporate other viewpoints into that discussion, which is totally valid. But it's gone to a point where we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. If we can't agree that there's such a thing as truth at all, and admittedly, in social sciences, truth is difficult. it's easier, in physical sciences. If I say to you, this is water, and you say no, hopefully if I show you that there are hydrogen and oxygen molecules, you'll agree and say, yes, it's water, that I can convince you. In social sciences, we're at a point where facts don't convince. Nobody can be convinced of their preconceived bubble. And that's very dangerous.
Seth, I think that might be vodka. I'm just letting you know. So again, I'm going to push back.
You found me out.
As I said, we go from the sublime to the ridiculous. But I want to show you this. I found this clip on Instagram. I think it was on Instagram, and I want to play it for you. That I think speaks to a lot of the stuff we're talking about.
What do you say is the main goal with tonight's protest?
I think the goal is just showing our support for Palestine and demanding that NYU stops. I honestly don't know all of what NYU's doing.
Is there something that NYU's doing?
I really don't know. I'm pretty sure do you know what NYU's doing? About what? About Israel. Why are we protesting here?
Palestine will be free!
I wish I was more educated.
I wish I was more educated is the throwaway line at the end.
It's unbelievable. I mean, it's so ridiculous that it's hard to believe that. So this phenomenon is fascinating. It's not as if it's the first time. I was involved in 1985. I was graduating Columbia, which is in the news again, and there was a huge protest on the divestment of the university's trust funds in South Africa. There was a big divest movement at the time, which was also the students took over campuses, etc. And many of the protesters didn't really understand the issues at play, but there was a swelling sense of the injustice of the apartheid regime that was overwhelming. And so that kind of took over, knowing the details of exactly what Columbia's endowment was invested in, etc. And I think today there's an overwhelming sense of that there's been a horrible situation created for Palestinian people, which I think is true. That doesn't take away from the atrocities and with the horror of October 7th. But this, like so many issues, has become overwhelmed by emotions and power as opposed to by facts and data. And this one is, of course, particularly hairy because, like most issues around irredentism, like who owns the land, they invariably have two sets of facts. Not in the example that you mentioned in terms of like what people were in this part of the world, in the Middle East. If you look at what happened in the ex-Yugoslavia regarding Serbs and ethnic Albanians and Croats, it was also irredentist issues. In other words, who owns this land? Who are the real people here? They're horribly difficult. So I'm not saying they're easy. I believe personally that, unfortunately, the situation today on campuses and in the world is tainted with a horrible form of anti-Semitism, which creates a double standard. I mean, so we can talk more about that. I'm not an expert in that field.
Well, I want us to go to number 2 and 3 in the secret sauce, but going back to even my soliloquy, I love Bill Maher. I love Bill Maher, and I'm not afraid to confess my love for him. I love his line, which is, I don't know this for a fact, I just know it's true. But he's been very interesting because he was the prototypical liberal, right, who then started coming out and wait a second, you're not towing the party line. You're speaking out against this political correctness and woke movement. Yes. You're speaking out in favor and in defense of Israel. Wait a second, are you one of us anymore? Right. Are you a traitor? Have you turned on us? And for me, maybe it's just because selective listening, which is like, now I still love everything about him. But I imagine there are a lot of people now going, you're not the guy we thought you were. And on the flip side, maybe Jon Stewart, I'm not sure that you, John, are the guy I thought you were because suddenly your opinions don't align with mine.
Yes.
So how do we get normalcy back? I mean, again, we'll get to number 2 and 3, But one of the questions I know that you are thinking about the whole time is how, forget about why we're so bitterly divided. How do we repair? How do we unite these two halves again?
Well, the short answer is by changing the incentives in the system that's broken. If the system has bad incentives, and I can come back to that, but there's a reason what you're talking about with Bill Maher, this on the left, this woke sanctimoniousness, this like religious belief that any stray from the doctrine of the left is not tolerated. This was true for many Malarian movements. I mean, it was true for Lenin and Stalin. I mean, this type of left movement that excludes and completely rejects any deviation comes from a philosopher named Herbert Marcuse. I don't know if you're familiar with him. It's Marcusian, and he came from the Vienna School. And the idea was that he grew up in the period when there was tremendous amount of being written about the colonial world and Africa. Frantz Fanon and many writers were talking about just the level of oppression systematic of the white world on the rest of the planet. And so the Marcusian philosophy ended up saying that we need an orthodoxy of not tolerating other viewpoints. We won't listen to other viewpoints because they use their views for power. Now, this is very well described in Susan Neiman's book, Left is Not Woke. The difference between the traditional liberal movement that I consider myself a follower of, and wokeism, which I think is a ridiculous distortion. And Susan Neiman in 100 pages explains what the key differences are. I could go into them, but we can't. We want to get to 2 and 3, so I'm not. But all I'll say is that the woke movement today of this orthodoxy is what's affected college campuses to a great degree, but it's also affected liberal young people in liberal areas in cities who are afraid to say the wrong thing. It's one of the reasons why those CEOs we talked about are afraid of speaking out, because they're afraid of being canceled or bringing on the wrath of some group. So I think the left is as dangerous as the right. And we can talk more about that. So that's why so much of it's the rejection of both of these poles that are ridiculous for different reasons. The right they're not in truth either. They think the election was stolen. There's still a lack of truth on the extreme right too. But the left, it's more about a sanctimonious religiousness that doesn't tolerate other viewpoints.
And so in many respects, we become our own worst enemy by being on this soapbox, by preaching, and through the double standards that have been shown up. Going back to October 7th with respect to Me Too, and suddenly the deafening silence in terms of advocating for women's rights, and not just women's rights, but I mean, we're talking about brutality at the most base level. So I think your point is right. I want to tell you, by the way, Seth, I feel kind of liberated today, because I was been doing these shows, and during the first 3 years of COVID, I couldn't say the word because the same damn thing was happening to me. So we'd call it the Global Patricia, and we'd go the events of March 2020.
Right.
And now the same thing is happening every time we talk about issues and not being afraid to talk about issues. It's like, and I'm a Democrat and I'm a liberal, but I'm also prepared to question and actually say, I'm not indoctrinated. I'm not a puppet. I'm not a clone. I'm not a drone. I'm going to speak up for what I believe is decency, common sense, and right and truth.
Well, this is what Bill Maher does. I mean, that's why you're what I admire also at Bill Maher, and I've watched him for years. Is that tenacious rejection of orthodoxy and the ability to think. We talked before about the attack on truth from the erosion of journalism. And to me, I mentioned that's a supply problem. But the demand problem is a little bit different. The truth going away on the demand side is because we don't teach, not even civics. in school, we used to have a focus on how to evaluate sources, how to make an argument, how to, the consumer needs to demand the truth based on thinking. And I argue in the book American Schism and elsewhere that our education system of the last 30 years has allowed science, technology, and math, STEM, to crowd out empirical thinking, civics, all the things you need to run a democratic republic. The French Enlighteners were marvelously interesting in so many ways, but one of the ways they gave a real contribution as compared to some of the other Enlightenments was their articulation of the need for an educated populace if we're going to have a representative democracy, and how actually, and what of course they were reacting to, Joseph, was centuries of education that was dominated by the church, which colluded with the king. So, there was a reason why they created this new framework of let's call it civic education. But if you don't have that, if you don't have educated citizens, invariably you fall to an autocracy or dictatorship where someone dictates the rules. So that's the demand side of this problem, which unfortunately there's no short fix, because it's actually it's a good segue to the second part of the secret sauce, if you want to go there.
And Seth, we will, but I was thinking kind of just to put a little cherry, a little bow on top. Forget about I want my MTV. This is I want my democracy. That's it was subtle, but I think kind of beautiful, which is when you talk about demand side, the demand side is how we consume content, but you're talking about a different demand. You're saying we need to demand truth. And just a quick little throwaway, because why not? The ban of TikTok. Because that's where we used to get our news from the fake news from actually Jon Stewart and the Daily Show until all news got called fake news by Trump. But now many Americans are getting their news from TikTok and similar sources. So what are your thoughts on the ban? And then let's go into 2 and 3.
Okay. So what's extremely complex about this is accurate information from an economic point of view is a public good, which means that it needs to be provided for the economy to function. And that's why we have an FDA to regulate drugs, and why we have all these regulations. There's a role for government in this area. Now, I'm not saying government should control media, but we did have before 1987, I think it was, something called the Fairness Doctrine, which was a government regulation that required what outlets that call themselves news, they were required to give equal time to multiple points of view on any issue. And, I'm talking back to the days of the Walter Cronkite era, which most of your listeners probably don't know what I mean. But there was a thing as objective news for a good part of the journalistic history. And it was a combination of the professional ethics we talked about before, along with some government regulation. Now, Reagan abandoned the Fairness Doctrine for the FTC in the 80s on the grounds that it was no longer needed. And I think what you see today is the result. Now, I would be very afraid. I am all for multiple sources. And when I say demand, I mean that the consumer can think for themselves and smell when something doesn't pass the sniff test, so that they don't watch something on TikTok and say, oh, that must be true. Because we have such a weak civic skill set on the consumer side, I would be nervous if my kids just watch TikTok for news. Now, I don't think it should be banned, but I am worried that where is the incentive for accurate information being dispersed in news channels? And so I'll give you one example. And I talk about this also in the book. One of the ills of social media is not only that it's a lot of it's fake, it's the anonymity. In other words, we in society realize that government needs to authenticate for many things. If you want to get a driver's license, you have to. If you want to drive, you need a license to show that you're capable. Well, imagine a version of TikTok or Twitter where every user was an authenticated person with a name, and they had to be accountable for what they post. So, all I'm saying is that I think there are solutions that would take away the incentives, which today are anonymity. So you can rage on any of these channels. You're not responsible for what you post. These are incentive issues that don't mean TikTok needs to be banned, but maybe there's certain regulations it has to apply to.
Well, let's jump for a second to across the pond, across the sea, to X land, and run by Elon Musk. Now, Elon did one thing. We'll talk about two things, right? The one thing he did was he took away the blue check mark meant something at the time. It meant that you were verified, and then anybody could just buy a blue check mark. So that took away the thing that you were talking about. But more recently, as on, and it's happening right now, is the Australian government are trying to take on and take down Elon Musk and X, because it was a terrible event that happened in Australia where a deranged person stabbed a bishop, I think in the eye multiple times. And the Australian government have said not only, should that video be taken down and not shown to any Australians, but they want it taken down and not shown to anyone else in the world. And that is literally happening right now. So where do you sit on this whole continuum?
I think that where I sit on this is I'm a big believer in free speech and the First Amendment in the U.S. But I also believe that right, like all rights, number one, is not absolute, and it entails certain responsibilities. Okay, so let's talk about social media platforms. Because they are, in my view, what they've argued for a long time is they've maintained that they're not publishers, they're just marketplaces of ideas. But in fact, as given the way distribution of information works, they are in fact, in my view, publishers. And I think they have to be responsible for ensuring that their speech, which should be free, doesn't, incentivize violence, threaten people. It can't be. There are certain limits to it. So I think the social media platforms have a role to play in policing what goes up. And I don't think the government should do it, but I think they should be held accountable. Now, TikTok's a great example because I used to use TikTok a lot, and I do admit, I was kind of supportive of where Musk was going. But if you look at TikTok today, which I'm sorry, not TikTok, I meant X, I meant Twitter. I don't really use TikTok. It was Twitter that I used to use. Twitter today, X, which is now called X, is really become a sewer. It's an incredible breeding platform for hate. Now, that's just the result of what's happening. I'm on it regularly and I see it. It's very scary. Do I think that the government should regulate Twitter or X? No. Do I think we need a better framework for how publishers, media platforms need to self-regulate? Yes. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's where I come down on it.
I'm just going to give you we'll give you the air horn segue and give you the opportunity to, people are watching going, what the hell is number 2 and 3?
Okay. Well, it's a little bit, this will be a little bit, it shouldn't be surprising. So I mentioned number 1 of the secret sauce when you look at our history is this empirical framework, which is fundamental. The second part is what I call, and people think this is trite, but it's what I call deep listening. So that's the term, deep listening. Let me tell you what it means. It means actively searching for and pursuing other points of view. Not giving lip service to them, but like I'll use an analogy. Were you ever Joseph, in your high school in a debate club?
I was.
Yeah.
Yes.
I could tell because you're a debater. So debate when you were in a debate club, you had your assignment was whether you agreed, whatever side you were on an issue, you were assigned a side, and you had to do the research and make a rational, reasonable case with data that supported your argument. That was what debate club was about. So when I say deep listening, that's what I mean. That's what we don't. Your clip on NYU's campus, those kids are not deep listening. They're not understanding what's really going on. So deep listening means really understanding other perspectives by getting deep into what are the facts that support that perspective, looking for them, being open to not only to not be deaf to them, but to actually search for them. And then to recognize that different perspectives, are deep, are nuanced. They really need to be understood by taking some time and effort to get into the shoes of whatever person's perspective you're trying to understand. So it sounds trite, but when I talk about deep listening, I mean, I would love to know your reaction. That's really what I mean. That's the second element of the secret sauce.
Oh, I completely subscribe to what you're saying. In fact, something that I talk about is even, and I might be going a little bit off the rails here, but even when we talk about the pumpkin man himself, DJT, it's the ability. By the way, we didn't even get to discuss the fact that House of Cards seemed to be like, is it just me, or is this thing like literally a crystal ball? Someone has a time machine. But my first port of call, and I'm trying, and I'm not perfect, and I probably screw it up more often than I don't, is find the element of truth, the kernel of truth.
That's right.
Because it's just not possible that one person can always be 100% right or 100% wrong. It is just not possible. And then go ahead and reject. Now, look, I also spend a lot of time learning and coaching now myself about and understanding what is the difference between hearing, listening, active listening. And at the end of the day, and you know this, Seth, is that when we are already formulating our response or our retort, we are not listening, which is exactly why I don't come into this episode with a single show note or a single question, because how do I know what you're going to say?
Right.
And so we end up having a real conversation. So the last thing I'll say, by the way, is one thing I remember when I used to debate, and this was kind of cool, but also very, very like frustrating, not frustrating, but this idea of you argue a case, let's take something like abortion, and you're arguing in favor, and then the little bell rings and you immediately have to do a 180.
That's right. That's what I'm talking about.
And you see the ease of how easy it is just to completely do a 180 without even blinking an eye. And that's like a sociopath. That's scary.
But that's the point, is that once you see that could happen, if you've been through debate club, you understand precisely what you're saying, and how there always is a lot of what Trump says and said. There is an element of truth that gets distorted. That's precisely the pathology. Now, I have 2 minutes to the hour, and I didn't get to 3. So do you want me to come back on and leave it as an open question, or?
Listen, let me tell you something. First of all, if you come back 5 times, you get a smoking jacket. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I'll give you a little bit more time if you have it, if you can spare it.
I do, and I do want to mention the third one, because it's the best example of so we talked about number 1, empirical framework, not letting emotions overwhelm data and facts. 2, the idea of deep listening and really doing a debate club number on any issue, giving yourself that assignment. And you're so right about people jumping to the defense before they hear the other person. Number 3 is about compromise. I mentioned it earlier. So let me explain what I mean by that. We have now been for 15 years in this country screaming about immigration. On the left wants open borders, the right wants to build a wall. 4 times we've had a comprehensive immigration reform bill that's been almost passed, but rejected for political reasons one way or another. Just recently, Trump told them not to pass it, even though the one that was written in January was written by a Republican and was very much closer to what the right had wanted. But because it would get in the way of his campaign path, he told the Republicans to reject it. Now, my point about compromise is that you have to know from the start that you're not going to get everything you want. That if you're going to go for, you could either, so now we've been screaming in immigration about opening borders and building walls. Are we any closer to a solution on what is a comprehensive, detailed set of problems? Immigration is complex. There are many nuances to it. There are things that need to be balanced. My point is, you have to recognize if you're going to get something done, it's going to be a compromise, and you're not going to get everything you want. So why is this number 3 and so important? Is because I feel that most of the political forces we hear about, and whether it's Marjorie Taylor Greene or AOC, they're predicated on not compromising. They want everything, and that's not how it works. So that's number 3.
I love it, and I'm glad. I think we even discussed it, or maybe I mentioned it in the soliloquy. The idea of compromise, meeting in the middle, and completely agree. Instead of the idea of zero sum, listen, it took 6 months to finally send aid to the Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. So that's another element. 6 months it took. 6 months.
The best example, if I can end with this one, the first part of the book, American Schism, goes through a very detailed explanation of the 11 years between 1776 and 1987. And that period was all about compromise. We never would have gotten to a constitution if there wasn't a tremendous set of compromises made between the two parts of the schism. And so it's very instructive because while the Constitution was far from perfect and it was amendable, it was a fundamental compromised framework. And that's a whole chapter in the book. I mean, I would love to talk about it more because I think it teaches us a lot.
Well, I think Seth is angling to come back, and who am I to refuse? By the way, I did notice that your shirt that you're wearing seems to be well color coordinated or texture coordinated with the cover of the book. So I just wanted to say that. The book is called American Schism, and now you know why, whether I made it up or not, Pulitzer Prize winning. It is absolutely being embraced, continues to be embraced. And you can find out more and buy it at americanschismbook.com. It's funny, Seth, I've spent my whole life as well writing books where I have to keep on saying, I told you so. And look, my first book was called Life After the 30-Second Spot. And guess what? It's more relevant today than it was back then. If only people would actually listen, actively listen, allow things to land, find the truth, and then figure out how to add, how to build on top, how to actually create something that is productive and, to use your word, somewhat of a compromise. If we do that, I don't know, the world, those raging fires that poor Elmo's trying to put out might just be, just enough to toast a marshmallow as we all get along together. How's that for a little close?
I think shows like this are part of the solution. So congratulations for what you do. Citizens should search out many sources of information that are beyond just headlines. And of course, that's what you do.
His name is Seth David Radwell. And by the way, if you are, if you're watching, and I see there is a ton of people watching live on Twitter right now, go ahead and please subscribe to the show and spread the word, spread that tweet. Let more people become part of the conversation. Seth doesn't say he's right. He doesn't say I'm wrong. And I don't do either. We're just two people that are committed to conversation. And, I'll give you the final word, but I'll tell you, when I wrote my second book, Join the Conversation, I said conversation is between two or more sides, not necessarily two or more people, because you can have 20 people all just nodding their heads and saying the same thing. That is not a conversation. Final word to you, Seth.
I would invite your listeners to reach out to me at that website that you gave, and I'd love to continue this. I think that fundamentally we have two sets of changes that we need to make. One are mindset changes, which relate to how we talk to each other, and the other side of the coin are structural changes, which change the incentives we didn't get to talk about. I'd love to talk about those at some point.
Well, we will see him back at some point in time before the world finally goes to hell in a handbasket in November. But until then, I leave you with the real. Forget about the Supreme Court. This is the man that really decides and makes that final judgment on whether a guest has been able to hold up to these incredibly high journalistic standards that we have here at Not Famous Land.
You are Chuck Norris approved.
And we will be back soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching the show about hope, positivity, optimism, and if there's time left over, a little bit of marketing with your host, multiple author, and global keynote speaker, Joseph Jaffe. If you like the show, tell a friend or two. Please subscribe to the show, and if you want to get inside news, previews of upcoming guests, and much more, visit JosephJaffe.com/subscribe to sign up for the show's newsletter.
And despite the best ministrations of your wife, you still look ugly.